Welcome in, everybody, to the CFB Nation All-America podcast. My name is Bill Troche, senior editor at sportingnews.com, alongside Bill Bender, our lead college football writer at sportingnews.com. Thank you to everyone listening to this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And for those of you who are watching on our YouTube channel on CFB Nation, if you have the time to leave a review on Apple, that would be great. If you had the time to leave some comments and a like on the YouTube channel, that would be great. Thank you to Irish Breakdown, your source for Notre Dame football information. They have a tremendous lineup of podcasts and great stories at irishbreakdown.com. Bill, we stand a mere 8 weeks from week 0. Summer's flying by. As you can tell, I'm struggling a little bit, playing hurt today with my voice. I'm working a tennis camp for the last few weeks, and the kids, they're wearing me down a little bit. They're wearing my voice down a little bit. I feel better than I sound, but you may be Vince Young carrying Texas to the national championship on this podcast. So just warning you right now.
Well, you sound better than yesterday, and, I get it. Any of us have coached kids, we know that we can lose our voice, but it must be a good camp if your voice sounds like that. So, we're going to power through this one, so I'll let you take the lead, and if you need me to tap in, I will.
Yeah, no, we're going to have some fun with this one. Like we said, we're 8 weeks from week 0. Summer's flying by, but we're gonna look at the ultimate prize in the sport, the national championship, the thing that a lot of programs work 52 weeks a year for. I think you and I aren't fully obsessed with who wins the national championship. We appreciate the sport week 0 through week 15 from the East Coast to the West Coast, but the national championship certainly is an important part of college football. And with Georgia sitting on 2 straight national championships and obviously going for a 3rd straight, no team since the AP started awarding national championships in 1936 has ever won 3 in a row, including shares, even 3 in a row where 2 were unanimous, and then 1 was a share of a national. Nobody has ever done 3. You had the idea yesterday to kind of look back at the last 3 teams that tried for the three-peat and just how remarkable those 3 teams were, how close they came and everything like that. So, why don't you take us through the 3 teams, and then we'll start talking about Alabama. But actually, before I forget, Troche trivia.
Yes,
to the Troche trivia. All right, so we're going to talk 2013 Alabama as a team that tried to three-peat, and the whole kick 6 game. No spoiler alert there. So my trivia question focuses not on the kick 6, but the game 2 weeks before the kick 6. Okay, 2 weeks before the kick 6, Auburn beat Georgia on the immaculate deflection. There's a miracle with 25 seconds left. It was a 73-yard touchdown that turned a sure loss into a victory for Auburn. Georgia had scored 21 straight points in the 4th quarter. They were down 20. They scored 21 straight points in the 4th quarter to take the lead right before Auburn pulled off its miracle. Who was the Georgia quarterback that led that 4th quarter comeback? We will get to the answer at the end of the show. Think about that. It's the 2013 Georgia-Auburn matchup. Georgia, incredible 4th quarter comeback, all for naught. So, all right, I'll let you jump in. Take us through the last 3 attempts at a three-peat.
Yeah, and I think the sport is better when you have this going on, when you have a team going for a three-peat. We've never seen it. We've never seen it in the Super Bowl era. So whenever you have this dominance, I think it is good for the sport in some ways that we're going to root against Georgia because they qualify for where you were when they lose. The next time they lose, we'll all know where they were, just like these 3 teams. 1996 Nebraska had won the 2 years before, 26 straight games, dominated the sport. Tommy Frazier, and then they lose. And we'll talk about Nebraska a little bit. We'll talk about that game. I know where I was. USC, you talked about Vince Young earlier. Everybody that's a college football fan that has any recollection of that game knows where they were when Vince Young went for it on 4th and 6. And of course, the kick 6. So with Alabama, it's so rare. This is only the 4th time in my lifetime that we've had a team have a chance to go for 3 in a row, how hard that really is. And that's why, although every major publication in this country is going to pick Georgia for the most part to win it this year, there's always that little bit of caution. I mean, when Alabama lost, I remember being in the sporting news. Well, I wasn't in the newsroom. I was at home. I just remember the shock value of seeing that happen. And I think we will experience that on some level whenever Georgia loses this year, or when it becomes clear that they can't three-peat.
Yeah, so I looked up the circumstances of Alabama's pursuit in 2013, right, of their excuse me, third national championship in a row. They're undefeated. They're playing Auburn in the last game of the regular season, and just some of the crazy things that happened in the kick six game before the kick six. Alabama, they missed a 44-yard field goal in the first quarter, obviously, came back to bite them. But in the fourth quarter alone, Alabama missed a 33-yard field goal. Then with 5 minutes to go in a tie game, they were stuffed on 4th and 1 at the Auburn 13-yard line. TJ Yeldon, no gain, with 5 minutes to go. They hold Auburn. They get the ball back. They drive down again with under 4 minutes to go. They have a 44-yard field goal to basically take the lead very late, and it gets blocked. All that happened in the fourth quarter before one of the most memorable plays in college football history.
Yeah, and then they got the second put on the clock. I do remember that because they Nick Saban politic to get that extra second on the clock so that the kick six happened. That's what I remember most, because you were kind of thinking, well, why not let the time run out now? Like as soon as you saw Chris Davis catch the ball, I was like, well, I bet he wished he wouldn't have done that, because you just saw it happen the way it did. I think AJ McCarron, a lot of it is what these teams shared in common is, it was a little bit different with Tommy Frazier because he was gone, and Scott Frost had taken over. But, AJ McCarron was a darling. We all, knew who his girlfriend was. We knew everything about him, being a Heisman candidate. And it was a big deal for, was it Catherine Webb? Was that her name?
Yes.
Maybe I don't know now, but I believe they're married. But it was, he was a celebrity, even though he wasn't really the best player in the country, because he was on this invincible team.
Right, and so the kick six was the fourth basically failed field goal for Alabama that day. And Alabama, I don't know how much of a favorite they were to win that, but it just shows you how close they were to winning. They did go on to lose their bowl game by 14 points to Oklahoma, but I think the motivation wasn't quite what it would have been had they continued their drive for a three-peat. But a lot of just flukiness, needless to say. You talk about remembering where you were. I remember exactly where I was, and it's a funny story. I was working at Sports Illustrated at the time, but my family had taken a trip up to Massachusetts to see my brother's family on Thanksgiving weekend. And my brother's family has a tradition where they go to a performance of A Christmas Carol on the Saturday night after Thanksgiving. Every year they go to Salem, Massachusetts. You get on a trolley. There's all these actors. You go to different spots. It's really fun, really good thing. And it happens early in the evening. And we watched the first half of the Alabama-Auburn game, and then just everybody went on to the performance. And after the performance was over, I wasn't checking my phone or anything. I got in my car. My friend Mitch Light, friend of the podcast, he's at The Athletic now, called me and asked me, we were about to go to dinner, and the whole family was in the car. I was in the parking lot, and he says, did you see the end of the Alabama-Auburn game? And I said, no, I didn't. And he said, it was the most incredible finish in college football history, and I am not exaggerating. And he took me through it, and like I said, I remember exactly where I was.
And that's, I mean, I didn't miss it. I watched it live because, Ohio State, obviously, it opened up some possibilities for them that season too, which ended up not happening. But it's always a big deal when Alabama loses. It's still a big deal when Alabama loses. 10 years later, it'll be a big deal if they lose when they lose their first game. So that's really a testament of these three teams. They're the one that's kind of stood the test of time because it's still going. 10 years later, we thought the dynasty was over then. We think it's over now. The season hasn't started. So that's really a testament to what Nick Saban's been able to do there.
Yeah. So there's the other two teams. It was 2005 USC, of course. They shared a national championship with LSU in 2003. Then they won it all in 2004. In 2005, they were undefeated. They made the national championship game. Again, so close to the three-peat. It just shows you how these back-to-back teams really have not dipped in that third season. USC was undefeated. They were playing Texas in the Rose Bowl, possibly the greatest college football game of all time. A lot of talent on the field. USC had a 12-point lead with 6 minutes to go. Texas drove right down the field, scored a touchdown, and USC needed to bleed the clock. One last possession to win their third national title in a row. Couldn't do it. They led 38-33. There was just over 2 minutes to go. They had a 4th and 2 at the Texas 45-yard line. Texas still had 2 timeouts to go. So had USC converted here, there's a possibility USC still could have forced a punt and had a minute to go. I mean, Texas would have had a minute to go, but this was basically the game. Lendale White, of course, was stuffed with Reggie Bush famously on the bench for that play. And then Vince Young just took over, drove the Longhorns right down the field, threw or ran for every yard, and then, of course, finished it with the memorable touchdown and the confetti and all that stuff. So, yeah, give me your thoughts on USC's. So they're this close to getting their three-peat.
Well, a couple of years ago, Sporting News did the SN 150 most impactful games of all time, and this was number 3 behind USC and Alabama in 1970, which was obviously a legendary game because it helped integrate the South in terms of college football. And then the fatigues game between Miami and Penn State, which, there's people that that'd be a good question for you. I mean, which one do you remember more, the fatigues game or this one? Because I'm gonna be honest, Bill, I was 7 years old for the fatigues game. This one, there's not a better game I've ever watched in my life, college football wise. This is the biggest one because of those things I was talking about. USC had won 30. They've taken it away, air quotes, with taking the streak away, but they've won 34 in a row. They were unstoppable. Again, Matt Leinart and Reggie Bush were national celebrities in college. They were the best show on TV. They were probably arguably in some ways better than watching the NFL. And that's very rare that you catch on a team like that. And here was Texas with Vince Young that was just absolutely unstoppable with that team. So the theater leading up to the game, having 3, I believe they finished top 3 in the Heisman, those 3 guys.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and the amount of NFL talent that was on the field.
And I'm 90% sure USC was number 1 and Texas was number 2 preseason.
Wire to wire.
And they didn't move.
Wire to wire. And
we were waiting for this game for 4 months.
And we don't, around here in Columbus, they don't like to talk about that because Ohio State had Texas beat. There was a drop touchdown in the shoe, and, Vince Young led the Lima Swede. You just say his name around here, people still know what you're talking about. He was the guy that made the diving catch to beat Ohio State. So, yeah, in terms of theater, Rose Bowl, Keith Jackson calling it. The play I remember most, though, Bill, honestly, is when Reggie Bush tried to lateral it on the run, and it resulted in a turnover. And it was one of those could have been another highlight reel play for him, turns into a disaster. And, of course, Vince Young being unstoppable that night. It's still the best college football game I've ever watched.
Right. And it was inevitable that he was going to tuck it on that last touchdown. And, USC provided an out for him. They did not contain him on the rush. I think the defensive end peeled to the middle a little bit, gave him a lane, and there was no doubt he was going to score. He got the 2-point conversion to get him up 3. And, USC, even if they did get a chance at a field goal, it was going to be for the tie. But yeah, just amazing. And, ESPN ran how many shows leading up to that game with USC being the greatest team of all time? That's the kiss of death right there.
They were comparing them to everybody. I remember the series. They were comparing them to, could they beat this Miami team? Could they beat, Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis Army in the 40s? They were absurd segments. But that was just spoke to the power of the celebrity that team had with Pete Carroll. I mean, in terms of coaching matchups, you had Pete, you had Mac Brown, you had Matthew McConaughey on the sideline. It had every bit of theater. Will Ferrell. I mean, that's the crown jewel college football game of my lifetime. And like I said, it's nothing against the Penn State Miami game. I know the significance of that. And, around here, I mean, there have been huge Michigan, Ohio State games, but nothing like that one. And I don't know the next time we'll see one, because it would have to be this year with Georgia being number one and somebody being number two all year. But we've kind of seen that a couple times with them in Alabama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we'll see. I don't know that there's a consensus 2 this year necessarily. Maybe it's Ohio State, and maybe, if those 2 do meet again, they had so much drama last year in the semifinals. So we'll see about that. But yeah, Texas USC's their place atop the food chain is pretty safe for the foreseeable future. The third team was 1996 Nebraska. Nebraska won it all in 94 and 95. They were ranked number 3 at the end of the regular season in 96. They were 10-1. They lost to Arizona State in the desert in the second game of the season, 19-0, which was a huge upset at the time. Arizona State ended up marching through. They were number 2 at the end of the regular season. I think they had 1 loss as well. I think they had a Pac-12 or Pac-10 loss. But at the end of the regular season, it was Florida State number 1, Arizona State number 2, and Nebraska was ranked number 3. But they had to first play in the first ever Big 12 title game against a 7-4 Texas before they were possibly going to get a shot to repeat to three-peat, because the bowls were lined up at the time prior to the Big 12 championship. It was going to be Florida State in the Sugar Bowl, and then it was going to be Arizona State in the Rose Bowl. They did not have a Pac-12 championship or Pac-10 championship game at the time, so they were locked into the Rose Bowl. And then number 3 was Nebraska. They were going to probably go and play Florida State in the Sugar Bowl. And then if they beat Florida State and Arizona State happened to lose the Rose Bowl, they would win the three-peat. But a funny thing happened on the way to the Sugar Bowl. They lost to 7-4 Texas in the Big 12 title game. Texas was a 20-point underdog, but quarterback James Brown, do you remember this incredible play? Texas led 30-27, less than 4 minutes to go. They had a 4th and 1 at their own 28-yard line, protecting this lead. And instead of punting, John Makovic calls a pass. James Brown throws over the middle to a wide open wide receiver. Everyone, I mean, all 11 Nebraska, I watched it yesterday, were just like rushing the line, blitzing. This guy was 10 yards behind the defense, catches the ball, goes 61 yards down the field, locks it up. Texas scores the next play to go up 37-27. Texas wins by 10, and Nebraska's quest for a three-peat is out the window.
Yeah, remember that game, and it's one of the great. It ushered in the conference championship era. Helped do that outside of the SEC, because at that time it was just the SEC. I remember everything about that game. I was sitting in my living room watching that. I don't know where my buddies were. I was by myself at the time, because I just remember calling them after, and we were all calling each other. I don't know why weren't all in the same house. Remember the Arizona State game even more, though, because
week 2.
Yes, it was early in the season. They had 2 safeties. A guy in my high school, Pete Rockus, actually was on that Arizona State team. He was our best player in high school, so we always kind of cheered for Arizona State a little bit until they played Ohio State in the Rose Bowl that year, which they could have easily won, by the way, with Jake Plummer. So, that was a big deal. And it was a big deal because Nebraska had dominated the 2 years before. We were so used to, as I described Nebraska to my son Grant, and I've told you this before, I just tell him they didn't throw the ball and they didn't have to, because they would just run people over, and their pass rush was ridiculous. So for them to get out physical was weird. This was part of the Scott Frost trajectory, obviously. I mean, coming off of the Tommy Frazier era, it was tough for Scott Frost because they lose that game right away. They lose in kind of fluky fashion to Texas. They had Priest Holmes too. I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, yeah, this was one where when they were done, we were okay, now who's going to win the national championship now? And didn't we got Florida State as a result, I believe,
Yes.
right? I mean, that
Yes.
was the consequence of this and the consequence of an awesome conference championship weekend.
Yep, and it's set the stage for the Big 12 like cannibalizing itself on national championship opportunities, because that wasn't the last time.
Right.
It cost itself a shot at a national title, and it was just huge upset. Like I said, 20-point favorite for Nebraska, and it takes some fluky things for these three-peats to get derailed, but it's also just shows you how difficult it is and how difficult Georgia's road might be in the next, the next season to come. So we will see about that. So one other thing we wanted to
real quick, I was just going to say, Bill, like to your end on Georgia, I've said it multiple times on this podcast of like, oh, you can circle them being 10-0 by the time they play Tennessee. Well, if one of those first 10 games is that loss, that will be the Arizona State moment that we'll be talking about 20 years from now. Be like, where were you when Vanderbilt beat Georgia? Why not, Bill? Where were you when Vanderbilt shocked the world? And
I will be passed out in shock on my living room floor if that happens.
I'll be filing to one of the copy editors that night because we'll have to wake you up. But that's all I wanted to say. We can move on.